Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to continue talking a bit about addiction, a topic that I've covered many times on this sort of channel. It's becoming, I suppose, my kind of niche. And, like I've said many times, it's something I'm very experienced in. And I think that's what gives me sort of a unique perspective with regards to creating content that will hopefully be of use to people listening, people who are suffering and going through addiction, which is, of course, a very human issue to have. At the root of addiction is a way of self-medicating pain, a apparent solution for soothing oneself and comforting oneself whilst they're in a situation which feels utterly hopeless. I think that's often the motivating factor, at least many people, sort of, to fall into an addiction. They find something that, almost works for them, that provides them a kind of a perception of comfort or euphoria or escape, and they sort of latch onto it, and they really grab onto this sort of thing which in the moment seems like it works. In the moment it seems like it gives you that sort of feeling of, but of course with all addictions, it's something that provides a short-term high, but a long-term, deterioration of our health, of our body and our mind. And, when we're in a situation where we're desperate for something that works, we will turn to anything, because all we're caring about, right, is how do I fix my pain right now, and often it's the object of addiction, whether it be a certain drug or a certain activity, which they will, reflexively turn towards, even if they know that it's bad for them. I think that's often the most perverse aspect of addiction, where you will knowingly do something that is detrimental to yourself. On a logical level, that there's this sort of demon within you that is sort of taking over, and that you're gonna, relapse. That you're gonna indulge in, this behavior. You've already given up on a certain level. And, but then you also know that you're damaging yourself. When I look back on my own personal addiction, I was addicted to many different substances, right? And the most powerful drug that I was addicted to is a bit of a lesser known sort of substance. It's known as 4-MMC, otherwise known as Mephedrone. It's particularly it's particularly famous in the UK sort of drug scene, because it used to be a legal high before it was banned. But this sort of drug is, widely sort of considered a sort of a mix of cocaine and MDMA, right? And it's sort of a very potent releaser of dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline in your brain. And particularly when you snort it, right? It's widely regarded as one of the most fiendish substances, where the urge to redose is utterly overwhelming, right? Insanely overwhelming. It's I look back on it, and it takes you to some crazy places. It's one of the most powerful tests of my own self-will, and it truly crippled me for a number of months, where I was sort of repeatedly binging on this substance, because it is, so powerful at providing sort of apparent, seemingly easy euphoria, right? I would often binge it and just go on these sort of music sessions for multiple hours. I would often combine it with other sort of substances and whatnot. And but the thing I will really want to narrow in on is that that feeling of having your conscious will totally taken over by something, right? And it's like, for me, when I look back, it was like the moment I took the first line, right? I had sort of given myself over to this thing, and I knew that, that rush, I will want to sort of repeat it. I want to pack on another rush and then another rush, because the rush, right, it's your brain, being flooded with dopamine, with serotonin as well, which gives you that sort of warmth. The dopamine gives you that very energize, to energize forward thrusting movement, to just explore. Everything's interesting, everything's exciting, right? And the serotonin is sort of making you feel warm and fuzzy. That's why people often look at this sort of drug as similar to MDMA. It's not quite the same as MDMA, but it's there are certain, what they call empathogen properties, where it will make me very pro-social, right? It'll make me very talkative, very very social in social settings. And I'm naturally incredibly introverted, right? I don't do well in social situations. I tend to sort of avoid them, particularly with lots of people. I find it very overstimulating. But I found myself at a phase in my life where I was at university, and I was, going out in lots of social engagements, right? I started experimenting with this drug, and I found it worked. It really worked for me. And I think that's where, a lot of people like to, look at certain substances and totally demonize it. And without a doubt, there are very profound negatives of this drug. But you have to sort of really step back and ask yourself, why am I using this? What am I getting out of it? And for me, particularly when I was using it in social settings, it would help me, completely conquer my sort of social anxiety. I could speak very freely. I was very energized. It was great for all this sort of stuff. But the good often comes with the bad, and the bad sort of came much, much later in my sort of relationship to this substance, right? And yeah, so I initially sort of fell in love with this sort of drug, and would use it socially initially, continually redosing it and stuff like that. And but in the initial days, I could have a modicum of sort of self-control, right? That's often the case with a lot of these drugs. Initially, you can sort of put it down, but it's when you're repeatedly cultivate a relationship with it over certain weeks and months. And for me, my Mephedrone sort of phase was very compressed. I was using it far more than you really should do. And as a result of that, it made my brain in a sober state naturally very depleted of sort of dopamine and serotonin. So I was almost, I came to be sort of very reliant on it, to the point where I was using it in situations where you shouldn't do, like when I was, working at my sort of part-time job at the time. That came sort of later on, and just using it on my own over and over again. I really stopped. There's a part of me that's just stopped caring about the damage that I was doing to my brain. And as well, I started sort of combining it with sort of ketamine as well, a dissociative, to create these very trippy sort of experiences when I was sort of playing music. And it was a very sort of, at that point of this sort of addiction, I was becoming more and more sort of closed off. I literally, I would not socialize if I didn't have access to the sort of drug. If I didn't have access to the drug, I would not go out, because I would just be like a zombie, right? But then eventually I stopped being interested even in socializing on this sort of drug. And that's the typical, journey of an addiction, right? It's sort of, many people first use drugs to sort of party and socialize in that sort of druggy scene, and then eventually start doing it by themselves, and their world just starts going smaller and smaller and smaller. And then eventually it's like the only thing that you find actually rewarding is just the drug itself. It was just me, snorting line after line after line, having a ball, having a party in my room, playing my guitar, playing my piano, playing my drums. And that was that. And the thing with this drug, Mephedrone, and you can research about it, is that the urge to redose is probably one of the most addictive in the moment drugs in the world, I would say. And that's from having used a number of different sort of substances. There are obviously some that I haven't tried in my sort of past, but without a doubt, it's one of the ones where you have to be very careful about how much you have in your possession, right? Because if you buy in relative bulk, you have a lot of it, right? And you just do a little one, it's going to be incredibly difficult, because there's this voice, there's this demon, this entity that arises within you that's just, because it feels so fucking good, right? Like it's one of the most euphoric substances created by mankind. When you have that rush, you just want to pack on another rush, and then another rush, and then another rush, and then you're doing it, and then next thing you know, it's like 4 a.m. You're this sweaty mess. Your pupils are fucking dilated. You've probably lost a bunch of weight. You're looking at yourself in the mirror, and you don't recognize what you look like, because you've just been snorting line after line. You're not even counting. You're not even dosing it. Right? That's where the drug took me to, and it's crazy looking back. Strangely enough, I don't have regrets, even though I got, I was getting, by the time I stopped, which was like over a year and a half ago, I was having, debilitating panic attacks. I was having really painful heart symptoms, and, bluing in my sort of knees and my feet, which is signs of the sort of vasoconstriction, the cutting off of blood flow, which happens with this sort of drug. Very gruesome stuff. People listening to this, you might find it remarkable. Why would you continue? Why would I continue to use a drug that, in the moment, I knew it was harmful for myself? I think, in a certain way, at that period of my life where I was at university, I was very socially isolated. I was very lonely. Right? I didn't have much going for me, much of meaning. I didn't really care about my degree. I didn't really have many close, genuine friendships. I hadn't met my wife. I was very alone, and it was just me, and I was bored. I was very, very bored. And I before I sort of got addicted to this drug, I was involved in weed a lot. I used to smoke a lot of weed, but eventually that sort of I stopped being as interested in that sort of substance, and then I guess this sort of Mephedrone drug, it was like I found something that really fucking worked, that made me feel alive, that made me feel invigorated at life. But the problem is that I just sort of really overly indulged and became dependent, became neurochemically dependent on this thing to feel good. And when this thing was eventually slowly, killing my organs, and as well ketamine, which I was very, very addicted to as well, and I'll probably make another video discussing that. I was sort of, just slowly withering away in my body and in my mind, but also dependent on these drugs to feel good, to feel anything. But eventually they lead you to some very nasty side effects. The depression that I had was very striking. It's like just sort of walking around, and you're watching reality, but you're not involved in it. You're very derealized, I suppose, very dissociated. I would often get what they call brain zaps, which are these like mild, like epileptic kind of symptoms in your brain, where often I'd be about to drift off to sleep, and suddenly my brain would jolt. And this often comes from sort of abusing serotonergic drugs. So I had to sort of treat that, and that was pretty gruesome. The panic attacks, The pressure on my heart was pretty gruesome, gnarly. And all these sort of things really sort of accumulated when the honeymoon phase of the drug sort of withered away, and I was there witnessing my psyche disintegrate. These sort of drugs did disintegrate my psyche. I remember just being, by the time, like towards the end, where I was sort of slowly confronting the reality of what I was in, my mind was very disinhibited, right? I'd almost sort of like, my psyche had almost reverted to a more teenage kind of consciousness where I was less mature, I was more impulsive, more emotionally volatile and stuff. Without a doubt, there was sort of neurodegeneration in my brain. And, but of course, despite all of this, in my sort of road to recovery, my road to healing, I always had a strong belief in the capacity of one's mind and one's body to regenerate itself. And I did very slowly sort of dedicate myself to just sort of, abstaining from this thing which I knew was bad for me. And eventually, towards the end, right, it stopped being pleasurable for me. Because initially, right, you have the pleasure of the drug, right, and the downsides of it are not that obvious to you in that moment. You're in, that's what they call the honeymoon effect. You're just riding the high, you're having a great fucking time, everything's amazing. You're fucking riding these euphoric waves of dopamine and serotonin, and everything's fine and dandy. Yeah, you have a few little come downs, but the come downs aren't that bad initially, right? The come downs only start to get bad when you become more and more spiraled down this sort of this dark tunnel. But that's far off in the future. But that's what happens. That's why we fall into these addictions, because the downsides are not obvious immediately. They only become obvious when you're dependent, when you're hooked on it. But when you come to be realized that, oh shit, I've probably got nerve damage in my legs because I've binged them so much. My bones my joints are all crackling because of all this sort of drug abuse and the lack of sleep spiraling up, and the weight loss. The weight loss was quite profound for me as well, because I would consume so much of this drug, and it's a stimulant. It suppresses your appetite. I wouldn't be able to eat physical food. I'd have to just blend smoothies and drink that to maintain some sort of calories. And it's weird. There was a moment, I suppose, during that addiction phase where I was just fueling my body. I was fueling my health so I could handle taking more drugs. I could handle getting higher and higher and higher. And when I was high, all I could think about doing was just, making music or just doing whatever, and just, other stuff. But my memory of it is quite hazy, it is quite hazy. That's the thing, you sort of give up so much of your life and your energy. But without a doubt, I don't regret it, because it initiated me into a certain awareness of myself and of reality that you simply can't attain without having gone through this sort of dark night of the soul experience. Of course, this is not an encouragement for people to get addicted so that they can learn more about reality, but it's really a way for people who are suffering with addiction to sort of transform their perception of their predicament. Right? The addiction isn't destroying you, although for some it can destroy you. The point is that when you are destroyed, to pick yourself back up and to begin that slow journey of healing. And you should understand that you don't heal these addictions overnight. They take a lot of time. And for me, it's been, over a year and a half, and I've healed a significant amount. My body's in much better place than it was, much healthier. My mind, my mental sanity is clearly here. But it was difficult, it took a very long time, especially with the amount of damage that I sort of did to my brain. It took a long time. The most important thing was just rest, really rest, good eating, not overdoing it. And, I'll go for these long walks in nature. I would contemplate a lot. I'd play a lot of music, obviously without drugs this time. And a lot of shadow work, to try and understand what has happened to me. Why did I fall into this sort of thing? And that took a lot of courage, obviously, to do that sort of shadow work, because you're confronting your raw human vulnerabilities. But it's the questions that we have to ask ourselves if we are truly interested in healing. Because we have to become aware of our patterns if we wish to change them. But I think that's been a lot there, so I'll leave it at that. That's been interested and insightful. Please don't hesitate to sort of subscribe, leave a comment, start a dialogue. I hope that's been interesting, everyone. And enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.